our webinar number 22 at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And this morning we will be discussing semiconductors, the semiconductor economics and weaponization of the semiconductor trade. So just a brief for those who are joining us for the first time. These webinars are held by the Institute of Economic Affairs. The Institute of Economic Affairs is a public policy think tank that is based in Nairobi, Kenya. And what we majorly do is we conduct research and use our research findings to host and convene dialogues on different policy areas, and also based on our findings, give possible policy recommendations that can be implemented. That said, this morning, our topic is on semiconductor economics and weaponization of the semiconductor trade that is being hosted by our trade program. So the IEA has 6 different programs. It runs across 6 different programs. So our conveners of today, that's the International Trade Program. And then we have our Public Finance Management Program. We have our Constitution, Law and Economics Program. And we have the Futures and Foresights Program. We have the Economic Competition and Regulation Program. And of course, we have our Popular Economics Program. And I'm sure you receive emails from our communications team. That's Oscar and Michelle, who sit in our PR, in our public relations and communications program. So that said, we will just delve into our conversation for this morning. And our conversation this morning, like I've said before, is on semiconductor economics and weaponization of the semiconductor trade. We feel this is a very important conversation that we need to have as we unpack to you what really semiconductor economics is about. And when you're speaking about weaponization of the semiconductor trade, again, what exactly do we mean? So today we want to delve into that world of semiconductors and explore the critical role that they play within the modern economies. And also, as we look at it, we also want to look at what are some emerging challenges that are posed by weaponization of the semiconductor trade. We all know, or probably as my colleagues Emmanuel and Maureen will be taking us through this, we will realize that semiconductors are a very fundamental building block in this digital age. We are really, really going digital. We have so many things that are being digitalized, and that brings in the concept of semiconductors, because our day-to-day devices that we use, from our smartphones to our computers to advanced technologies that are coming in like artificial intelligence, all of these are being driven or being powered by semiconductors. So we have seen semiconductors becoming very vital drivers when we are speaking innovation, when we are speaking economic growth, and when we are speaking national security. So this morning, we just want to understand and bring an understanding to semiconductors, so that as this conversation of digitalization are going on, we also understand this concept of semiconductors and the challenges that come with it. So Emmanuel and Maureen will be looking at the economic impact of semiconductors and what role they play as far as infrastructure is concerned in modern economies. So when you're speaking in infrastructures, we will probably limit ourselves to the economic economic infrastructures. And then also they'll also be looking at the effect of weaponization of semiconductor supply chains on developing country economies, because we will see, we know that developing countries will be having or are already looking into how to effectively use these semiconductors as they come into the market. But as we look at that, there is the effect of weaponization of these semiconductors that we are likely to experience as developing countries. So what really will be the impact of that, and what really will the effect of those be? And then also we would want to try and unpack the importance of semiconductors, not just as a day-to-day question, but also look at it as a question of economics development. So this morning we will have my colleagues Maureen Maureen Barasa and Emmanuel Washendo. Emmanuel sits in our International Trade Program and Maureen sits in our Popular Economics Program. So they will be taking us through this, each having about 15 minutes to make a brief presentation. And then my colleague Melody will come in during the question and answer session so that we can see if there are any questions that Maureen and Emmanuel need to respond to, and then we will make a conclusion. So a few housekeeping before Maureen comes in. That That said, we will have an opportunity for you to type in your questions if you have any. So during the question and answer, Maureen and Emmanuel will be glad to respond to your questions. So as they will be making their presentations, should you have any questions that you feel needed to be responded to, please be typing it in the chat box, and Maureen and Emmanuel will be very glad to have a go at the end of their presentation. So without taking too much time, I'd like to invite my colleague Maureen Barasa to take this away. Maureen, karibu sana. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Winnie. I'll be taking you through we'll just go through the outline. I'll be taking you through the introduction. That's the background, history, economics of semiconductor trade, and the Moore's law. Then world export and import values of integrated circuits and countries involved in export and import of integrated circuits. Then my colleague Emmanuel will be taking you through the rest. That is the state of trade in processors and controllers. We'll be looking at the global trade and the trade in Africa for integrated circuits and microprocessors, and what development questions arise from this trade, and what is the shape of African participation in global trade in integrated circuits. Sorry. And how are developing countries indirect consumers of controllers and microprocessors, and finally we'll do a conclusion of the same. Thank you. Moving on, we look at the background. What are the integrated circuits or microchips? These are more or less intermediate products, which acts as an input for other final goods. These final goods include mobile phones, refrigerators, cars, watches, our computers. Basically, during the interaction in your day, you get to use integrated circuits or microchips in one way or another. You're one of the consumers of these integrated circuits and microchips. The semiconductor industry encompasses the entire chain of design, manufacture, and installation of integrated circuits called microchips. So it's all the way from the design to the assembly of the final products, say maybe phones, maybe a microwave, a fridge, and the likes. And like I've mentioned before, we have like direct and indirect consumers of integrated circuits. And who are these direct and indirect consumers of integrated circuits? So for the direct consumers of integrated circuits, they manufacture the final goods, for instance, electronics and aircrafts. They get to buy the integrated circuits and use them in manufacture of the final goods. The normal electronics that we get to interact with on our day-to-day basis with the rapid urbanization that has occurred. And we also have the indirect consumers of integrated circuits, and these comprise of all those who purchase goods and services that require integrated computer chips. These are the consumers who buy phones and other electronics, including maybe a sound system, television. All these products require integrated circuits for them to function. So our discussion today will be based on the economics of semiconductor trade and the weaponization of the trade. And we'll be identifying integrated circuit as an essential good in our day-to-day lives. And we'll be looking at data on trade uh, for imports and exports of uh, integrated circuits. So moving on, we'll be looking at the history of a brief history of the semiconductor industry. The semiconductor industry was one of the earliest and most radical examples of globalization since the pioneering of the Fairchild semiconductor opened its Hong Kong plant in 1963. So we can see that this is an industry that has always existed with even the setup of the world's largest computer all the way to the personal computers that we now have and even the phones, all that evolution that has occurred, the semiconductor industry has always existed. And perhaps it's essential if you have this discussion. And then I'll go to the economics of semiconductor trade, and we look at it in terms of two angles. That's the specialization and international division of labor, and the comparative advantage and economies of scale. And for specialization, we understand specialization as a method of production whereby an entity focuses entirely on the production of a limited scope of goods to gain a greater degree of efficiency. And for the international division of labor, it cuts across various maybe countries or bodies doing different bits to come up with the final product. And I'll illustrate this using a basic example of a cell phone that's an iPhone, or maybe we can just use any other phone that you own. Yeah. So looking at this, we look at the basic technology for iPhone, the one that you're using maybe to stream the webinar. It was developed in the US, and the architecture of the processors that run it is designed in the UK, and the lithography machines that make it possible to manufacture these processors were built in the Netherlands. And the processor has been produced in South Korea, and the final assembly for the cell phone was done in China. If you get to maybe look at your phone, maybe when it's fairly new, you can get to see all these. Maybe you can see the assembly was done maybe in China and all this. So it's an embodiment of various countries playing a role in coming up with the final product. That's the iPhone. The basic technology whereby the US maybe comes up with the design, then the architecture of the processors designed in the UK, the lithography machines are built in the Netherlands, and the processor is produced in South Korea, and then the country that does that has a manufacturing plant for the final product of the cell phone, that's based in China. Moving on, we have the comparative advantage and economies of scale. In economics, when you look at the comparative advantage is the economy's ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than the competitors. If a country, say Kenya, can produce maybe basic examples such as tea better than Uganda, maybe it should leverage its weight on producing tea, and maybe Uganda should produce something else that it has its comparative advantage. Then we have the economies of scale. The economies of scale, but just an explanation, is the proportionate saving in costs gained by an increased level of production. When you look at the economies of scale, East Asian countries that are majorly known for participating in semiconductor trade, both in terms of imports and exports. We'll see this later in our slides. Uh, the first generations of chips will never have been cheap enough for mass production. And this has helped generate the enormous economies of scales that transform the industry. What do we mean by this? East Asia produced cheap cheap labor costs, and this helped generate chips that were cheap. Meaning microchips that were cheap in for mass adoption. Like there's been a mass adoption worldwide of final products that have been produced using microchips, and we will see this as why is there like a huge consumption of consumer electronic goods that have been made by microchips. This is because of rising household disposable income levels. We have the rapidly growing population and increasing urbanization. They create a massive demand for regular and advanced consumer electronic goods. Then moving on, we'll be looking at the types of semiconductor companies. We have three types of semiconductor companies. We have the chip manufacturers, we have the fabless chip manufacturers, and the chip equipment makers. The chip manufacturers, they own the fabrication plants, that's the chip making plants. Then we have the fabless chip companies, the fabless chip companies, they hire contract manufacturers to make chips that they design. And then we have the final people in the whatever in the hierarchy of semiconductor companies, who are the chip equipment makers who manufacture like the final chip product. Then we have the market for semiconductor trade is characterized by steep investment and delayed returns. And we'll illustrate this using an knowledge of how these things work. For 12 to 24 months, it takes 12 to 24 months to build a Fab Lab and install the tools. Then it takes 12 to 18 months to ramp up to full capacity. And with high utilization, these Fab Labs can take up to 5 years to earn profits. So it takes a lot of investments, and you'll see this in the Moore's Law, to invest in getting the final products. And with the advancement of technology each and every day, it takes a lot of products to gain the final product, the microchip that can be used to manufacture the main products. And if you can remember, the microchip is an intermediate good, like it comes in between the chip and the final product. That's the phone, the fridge, and whatnot. And also, the market is also characterized by rather thin margins. This means relatively small profits are earned by the people who are involved in manufacture of microchips. Moving on, still to stress on the point of division of labor and comparative advantage. It's to mean no region has end-to-end capabilities for semiconductor design and manufacturing. We can see through the value chain, the generation order from the equipment to the materials. That's a non-wafer materials. Then you have the wafer materials. Then you have the IP and electronic design automation. Then you have the fabless. Then you have integrated device manufacturers. Then you have the pure play or foundry. Then you have the semiconductor assembly or testing services. This is more or less the value chain, all the way from design and conceptualization to the final product that you have. That's your phone, your MacBook, your tablets, or whatever. Yeah, and we can see that there are like a couple of countries that are involved in this semiconductor design and manufacturing. We have like the four major countries. That's the United States, Taiwan, Europe, China, and the rest of the world. Yeah. So looking at equipment, we have the US as the major, the United States as the major player in this, then Europe, then this the rest of the world, then Europe and Taiwan. No, I mean China, sorry. Then for the materials, we have the major player, we have the rest of the world, then Europe, then we have the United States. And looking at this table, we're able to sort of the knowledge that we're getting from this is that there needs to be division of labor, specialization, and comparative advantage to come up with a final product. So there's so many players all the way from design to the final product to get the end product. That's maybe your phone or maybe the car that you drive. Moving on, we'll be looking at the Moore's law. The Moore's law, in 1965, an electrical engineer, Gordon Moore, wrote an article about the economic implications of scientific advancements that were contributing to falling costs of components. In 1965, when Gordon Moore was working in the research and development department of the Fairchild semiconductor industry that's in Hong Kong, he wrote it was more of a marketing article. And the Moore's law is recognized as an observation and projection of a historical trend. And he believed that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit doubles about every 2 years. What do you mean by this? He believed that the number of components that will fit on a semiconductor would increase. It was more of a projection of an increase in the number of components, or rather transistors that are used that will fit on a semiconductor device. And semiconductor devices would offer more computing power with decreased prices. Whereby, if we go back, we saw that there was steep investments because of the advancing technology and reduced prices because of the many players in the market. And also, the Moore's law assumes that at present, the latest generation of microchips have some 80 billion transistors, which are very complex and so expensive to develop and manufacture. And the combination of these two, the complexity and cost, has led to reduction of companies in the sector. So currently we have like around three. We have Samsung, we have Intel in the US, and I can't remember the third one, but yeah. Moving on, we look at the world values of integrated circuits, and these are exports for the world in the year 2009. The source of our information comes from the Observatory Economic Complex, and the total exports for the world in the year 2009 was $12.2 trillion. And from this, we can see, if you can see the chart clearly, the major exports for the world, there was crude petroleum, which was 7.09% of the $12.2 trillion. Then we have the refined petroleum, which was $4.02 trillion. Then we have CAD, which was 12.2, which was 3.66 of the $12.2 trillion. Then we have coming in. Next was the packaged medicaments, which was 2.44% of the $12.2 trillion. Then we have integrated circuits and products, like the final products from the integrated circuits, that's the computers, the telephones. If we add these up, we can see that integrated circuits and the final products that are generated from the integrated circuits sum up to a huge percentage of exports for the world. From the year 2009. Moving on, we'll be looking at world import values of integrated circuits, and the world export values for 2020 total to $16.7 trillion for the year 2020. And we can see that the exports value was the integrated circuits, the export value was at 4% of the $16.7 trillion in 2020. And this can only prove the Moore's law, whereby he stated that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit doubles about every 2 years. And the export value for integrated circuits, if we compare 2009 and 2020, there's an immense growth from 2.28% all the way to 4% between the 11 years. And the countries involved in exports of integrated circuits, that's what you're looking at next. Which countries export integrated circuits? Which countries participated in the export of integrated circuits? That is in 2020. And we have most of these countries are from the East Asia region. And the one that had like the largest share of exports of integrated circuits was this Chinese Taipei at 20.7%. Then we had China at 16%. Then we have South Korea at 13.3%. Malaysia at 9.7%. Then we have Singapore at 9.3%, 36%. And the country that follows is Japan at 4.68%. These are like the major players in export of integrated circuits. Then we have other countries also in Asia that participated in the export of integrated circuits, that's in the year 2020. And this totaled to $669 billion. And moving on, we look at which countries import integrated circuits. That's in 2020, and it totaled to $669 billion for all the import trade that happened on integrated circuits in 2020. And we have Hong Kong at 24.3%, followed by China at 21.6%. Then we have Singapore at 7.63%. We have Chinese Taipei at 7.26%. South Korea at 5.77%, Vietnam at 5.11%, then other countries in Asia, as well as the United States also, and Mexico. From these two charts, we can conclude that integrated Asia is dominant in demand and supply for global trade in integrated circuits. And we can see that nations that are dominant on the demand side are not necessarily dominant on the supply side. And this is illustrated by countries that export integrated circuits. The Chinese Taipei are topping on the list at 20.7%. But when it comes to countries that import integrated circuits, we have Hong Kong that's at the top of the list with 24.3% of the total $669 billion. This only stresses on the point of comparative advantage, where nations with concentration in supply chains of integrated components, and you can see there's a concentration in East Asia, and this has intensified since the mid 90s. Yeah, thank you. My colleague Emmanuel will take you through the rest of the slide.
Two words: ubiquity and diversity. Ubiquity as in everywhere. We look around us and these chips are invading more and more of our space, or rather, we are asking for more computing power to be provided us to do all these sort of different things, right? And that is what was illustrated with this chart, right? Showing the global trade. And then our colleague, my colleague Maureen, just showed us how not only has the trade in integrated circuits been growing in its importance, but even the products that use the integrated circuits as inputs, right? Have the trade in those products has also grown. We're using computers in more and more places in our lives, right? We're trying to harness the capabilities provided by these chips in all that we do. Not only are we doing that, but we're doing that at an increasing rate, right? Now, this chart here shows us again that the importance of this trade has grown. Now, this was the year 2020. That was the year during which uh, the world faced the COVID pandemic, right? And what COVID-19 was characterized by on the economic front was twin supply and demand shocks. Now, as more people were sitting at home, the demand for devices actually for the kinds of devices that enhance connectivity, communication, right, ICT, some of those basic the devices with which we mostly interface when we're trying to communicate and do work and entertainment. The demand for those products grew, and this, you could say, drove semiconductor supply chains in a certain direction, a direction from which they have since been trying to correct back because some of that demand has fallen. But finally, the most important trade in the globe is usually the trade in crude petroleum, right? When we talk about the value, the dollar value of trade. In the year 2020, the value of integrated circuits actually surpassed the trade in crude petroleum. It will continue to challenge the place of crude petrol, the first position of crude petroleum as time passes. Now, we chose another product here, another derivative of the integrated circuits, right? That is called processors and controllers. So this is a more specific type of chip, a chip that has more capabilities than the plain vanilla integrated circuit. And here on these two charts, we can see imports and exports of importers and exporters of processors and controllers in the year 1996. And what we see is that in that year, wait just a second. So what we see in that year is that on the export side, the East Asian region actually dominated the exports of processors and controllers, right? So the United States was the single largest exporter of processors and controllers, but still the East Asian region was the most important exporter. On the import side, we see uh, the other parts, the other regions of the globe actually taking part in the trade. But Africa there in yellow is a very small part of the global trade, right? Less than 2% of the global trade. Oceania and Latin America also there as very small players in in the global import trade of processors and controllers. You go back again to the export side, and these regions are barely exporting or almost zero. They have very little significance on the global trade. We go on to the year 2020. Not only has the mixture, right, the profile of trade by region, in terms of regions who are engaging in this trade, not only has this profile changed, but the size of the market has also grown. We went from 145 billion to 669 billion dollars annually in the year 2020. Again, this just highlights once more that not only is a traded integrated circuits, just plain vanilla circuits growing, but the trade in one of the most important configurations of integrated circuits is also changing. In one of the most important flavors of chips is has grown. Now we look at the regional makeup and we notice that the United States is a much less important player in the year 2020. So the East Asian region has actually grown in its comparative advantage in the production of processors and controllers. Now, not only that, but the countries that were previously the dominant players in East Asia have actually changed. So Japan, right? Japan that exported 18% of all chips now exports 4.68%. Of course, that's again 4.68 of 69 billion, still very significant, but smaller share of the total. Chinese Taipei taking a very significant 20%. When it is recalled, right, that Taiwan is actually a very geographically a small country. Its GDP is so compared to the size of its economy, its size of the geographic size, actually Taiwan is an outsized player in the export of processors and controllers. On the other side, Hong Kong and China were the major importers. What explains the difference between the export and the import side? Well, it's that those who are importing these chips are also home to many factories that produce, say, the consumer electronics or motor vehicles that use these chips as inputs. Right? Recalling again that the chips are intermediate products. Here we can see that this chart from the Patterson Institute of Peterson Institute of International Economics actually shows how the major players in the semiconductor trade actually trade for different kinds of chips, right? So I have a comparative advantage of this kind of chip. I need that kind of chip, and we trade them. And you can see that the types of chips being traded are of different cost, different value. So a country like China exporting some of the more cheaper types of chips, right? These chips on average, $0.19 per chip. On the American side, they're exporting the more expensive kinds of chips, right? The probably more technically capable chips. They're more complicated chips to make. Now we come into the African continent because the question here is, what does, we've seen on the news that there is an ongoing trade war and that chips between the United States and China, the United States also and some of its say its militarily aligned countries, countries with which we have close economic ties, are actually working to reorganize the global supply chains of semiconductors. Those comparative advantages that exist in the semiconductor trade represent the difficulty in doing in housing, not only housing all the phases of the manufacturing process in one region, but even within a single company, right? So you manufacturing the most advanced chips today requires a type of a globalized supply chain that no single region, let alone firm, has, right? All things equal, when the markets were free, the American firms that were doing the research, the design, the manufacture, and the packaging of these chips started moving the packaging offshore. Some of it started going to Mexico, then it moved to East Asia, countries like Japan and South Korea, Taiwan. What does all this say? That it's going to be extremely costly to rearrange these supply chains. But the actors remain determined to do so, right? Their actions will also cause shortages or disruptions in the supply of these chips. So what will these disruptions mean for countries on the African continent? In Africa, in the year 2020, imports of integrated circuits, specifically the processors and controllers, were just valued at 152 million. Go back, remember that the trade is worth 600 and something billion. Africa is only importing 152 million. Sorry, actually importing 331 million and exporting 152 million. The major importers and exporters of the chip were two players in the on the import side. Countries like Tunisia and Morocco and South Africa were the major players. What's peculiar about these specific African countries? Well, for one, manufacturing footprint. South Africa is a very more significant manufacturer than all other countries actually on the in the sub-Saharan region. So that accounts for that geography. Now, the North African countries, not only do they have some significant manufacturing footprint, but they are located close to Europe, right? So presumably, my assumption looking at this data was to say, okay, perhaps the geography plays a role. Perhaps the geography tells us something about the fact that a country like Tunisia is the major importer of processors of specifically a more advanced kind of integrated circuit. So they're doing something with them in Tunisia that cannot be done in other African countries. It could also be that some of these chips are destined for re-export. That's also possible. Now, when we zoom out and just look at integrated circuits in general, right? And look at the plain vanilla integrated circuits. Well, Africa is a bit more of a significant player than it is in the market for the more advanced chips, which tells us something, which tells us that the it's a reflection, again, of the insignificant manufacturing footprint of African countries, right? That is, these African countries have very little use for advanced computer chips. They have a bit more use for the less advanced computer chips, but still at 1.19 billion, the import trade is not that significant on the world scale. And on exports, with exports of 401 million, exports also not too significant. But again, we see the countries that are major players in the exports of normal integrated circuits are Morocco and Tunisia, perhaps assembling these chips for the European market that is very geographically, what is it, convenient, perhaps. Now, what does all this mean for the African continent? So, in 2020, Africa were net consumers of integrated circuits. Kenya in particular made 2 million in imports and 1.23 million in exports of the product. Kenya also was a net importer of integrated circuits. The market remains dominated by East Asian countries. But now, when we look at the trade in integrated circuits in Africa, these African countries are actually importing and exporting the product as an intermediate good. But when you look at the import bill for many African countries, they're importing a lot of manufactured goods, a lot of consumer electronics, motor vehicles. And what do all these goods have? They have embedded within them these chips. So that means that Kenya and other African countries are net consumers, both on the intermediate, but even more significantly in the market for final goods. What does this mean still? Remember that in 2008, Steve Jobs and Apple, or between 2007 2008, they introduced the iPhone, and this ushered in the rise of the smartphone. And what is a smartphone? Well, a Kenyan citizen earning on average about 2,500 and some change per capita income can buy a smartphone at just about $40 or $50 if it's coming from China, where most smartphones are actually assembled, including the iPhone. So he can buy this $40 a piece. And what does he have in his hand when he buys this smartphone? Well, he at $40 can afford more computing power than NASA could with its $50 billion budget in today's dollars in the 1960s, right? So that's very significant computing power. So the computers that they use to put stuff on the moon were not as powerful as the computers in the average Kenyan's hand. This means that the average Kenyan who can afford and who does purchase a smartphone is actually that much wealthier because of the smartphone. His welfare has increased, right? And his welfare increase is so significant that even NASA in the 1960s could not have afforded to access the same level of computing power. This means that, like, okay, let's take another example. If you consider that in the year in between 2000 and 2009, okay, take China's per capita income, which today is at just about $12,000, and Kenya's at $2,000. A country like China has seen a significant improvement in just the last 15 or 20 years in its per capita incomes. Kenya, comparatively, not so much. But despite, say, the slow pace of change, the slow rate of growth in per capita incomes, Kenyans their welfare has improved because of the scientific and entrepreneurial efforts of firms and actors far afield, way outside in East Asia and in North America and in Europe, right? This means that, let's say, if we assume that part of it is the policymakers in a country like Kenya have failed to create the conditions necessary to produce more significant growth in per capita incomes. This means that despite their failures to institute wealth creating policies, Kenyans got wealthier anyway because of this convergence of science and economics that happened elsewhere. So then this means that that African and Kenyan policymakers should actually perk their ears a little bit when they hear that there is a disturbance in the market for chips. And they should ask themselves, wait, this device, this thing that has made our residents wealthier, this device that continues, whose demand continues to grow, even in Kenya, even in Africa, could now face disruptions. That's something to be concerned about. Now, here we have a chart that shows us what the destination for these chips, right? Where these chips went in the year, I believe this is 2009, but I see that the chart doesn't have the year. My excuses. Now, in that year, most chips were actually destined for consumer electronics, right? This is 2019, excuse me. More than 3/4 of chips sold in that year were destined as inputs for consumer electronics and motor vehicles. What do Kenyans import a lot of? Motor vehicles and consumer electronics, the refrigerators, the white goods, microwaves, uh, cars. They all have computer chips. Why do cars have computer chips in the first place? Look, you go back to the 1970s, oil crisis, motor vehicle manufacturers are looking for efficiencies because all of a sudden, the major consumers in places like the United States are more concerned about their per gallon efficiency. How do you get this efficiency? Well, you need the engines to fire a bit more efficient, to use more of the petrol efficiently. How do you do that? You might actually start using computers, which is what they did, to make sure the engines are kicking just right so that fuel is spent more efficiently. You needed computer chips, right? This is one of the first applications for computer chips in motor vehicles. So because Kenyans and Africans are consuming more cars, right? That's at the household level. Firms, firms that import these computer chips use them to produce devices that say doing different things. Like if you picture your typical cybernetic device, that maybe it's controlling a thermostat or controlling water levels in some mechanism to control the flow of water from a water tank or a water processing and distillation plant or something, right? You might want to custom make a device, and that customization of the device will require uh, imports of integrated circuits. So what does that then mean? That means that if you have a policy now on the government side that is hampering or deterring or slowing down the imports of integrated circuits, you're actually destroying some jobs that might be quite important, right? So there's a job creation pillar to this argument. So firms would benefit from some of the goods that they consume that have integrated circuits embedded within them, but they'll also benefit for if they use these devices to make some custom made machines they're using in their production processes. Now, the chip, as we can see, is important and continues to grow in its importance. Governments in Africa and the Kenyan government are offering more and more uh, digitized services. What physical architecture do you need to achieve digitization of public services? You need chips. Suffice it to say that the chip is important all around the world, and in Africa. So here again, since the year 2009, Chinese per capita incomes increased by 200% to 12,556. This is just about 2020, right? In the same period, Kenyan per capita incomes grew by 98% to $2,000.81. So despite the slow change in incomes, the chip made Africans and Kenyans wealthier. You put all this together, this means that where chips are being traded as intermediate goods on the African continent, we should actually examine the tariffs placed on these goods. And one might ask, okay, if you discover that the tariffs are high, why are they so high and why shouldn't they be lowered? Another policy question here is positioning. In the very first place, we can see that it's important for African and Kenyan policymakers to pay attention to the developments in this realm. It's not constrained to some esoteric thinking being generated in DC or in Beijing or Brussels or London. This is a market that even Nairobi should be concerned about. In this way, the integrated circuit is a development question. I will conclude again at this chart that shows that no region has end-to-end capabilities for semiconductor design and manufacturing. If it costs $5 billion just to build a normal factory, and you've got to wait the number of months that my colleague told us in order for it to be profitable, right? This means that this is a sector that is extremely costly to break into, extremely costly to reconfigure, and reconfigurations can be very, very disruptive to say, if you take the just-in-time manufacturing models that are pursued by firms in, say, Japan. Talking about you need semiconductor chips delivered just in time. And if a firm is not trying to hold too much inventory, they face shortages. The shortages have negative effects on their production, and that can also have negative effects both on the cost of products consumed, but even on the availability of these products. And so with that, I end our presentation, and I thank you so much for listening.
All right, so thank you so much for the presentation, Emmanuel and Maureen. That was very insightful, just to unpack this concept of semiconductors. And it is just interesting to hear that semiconductors is a new phenomenon. It's something that has been in existence, and it's as old as Chinese independence, seeing that introduced probably in the as early as 1963. So I wouldn't want to delve so much into the presentation. I would like to leave this to our participants and just to see what kinds of questions that they have that would further enable them to just understand if there were areas that they didn't quite clearly get. It would be, now is the time to raise your hand or type in your question just for us to get your question. Yeah, so my colleague Melody will take over the Q&A session. I can see there are already people who are curious to ask questions, some hands already raised. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can also type them in the chat box and my colleagues would be able to respond to them. So Melody, if you're here, you could please take away the Q&A.
Thanks, Winnie, and thank you, Emmanuel and Maureen, for the informative presentation. Maybe I'll just do a brief summary of what they've talked about. They've informed us that a microchip is an intermediate good that is used in the manufacture of final products, particularly electronics, and motor vehicles. And then they've shown us that the semiconductor value chain is based in 4 main regions, that is US, Taiwan, Europe, China. And there's been growth in the trade of semiconductor trade. In the semiconductor trade in 2009, the global trade over the total global exports were worth $12.2 trillion, and the integrated circuits represented 2.28% of this trade. In 2020, the global worth of exports was $16.7 trillion, with the trade in integrated circuits accounting for 4% of the global trade. So they've also told us that the countries that are involved in the exports of ICs in 2020 were mainly in the East Asia region, that is Chinese Taipei, China, South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, Japan. And also in the same manner, these same countries are also heavily involved in the imports of ICs, that's Hong Kong, China, Singapore, Chinese Taipei, South Korea, and Japan. So as you have seen from the charts, that the East Asia region dominates in the global trade. And they've also informed us that in 2020, the value of trade in ICs surpassed that of crude oil. They've also shown us the status of African continent in the exports of ICs. And we've seen in 2020 that the exports of ICs in Africa were worth $400 million as compared to the $669 billion of trade in the exports. So it's just a small fraction. And Morocco, Tunisia, Mauritius are the countries that have top exports in Africa of ICs. And then when it comes to imports, we've seen that Africa imports ICs worth 1.19 billion, with major countries who import being Tunisia, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Morocco. And one significant thing about these countries that they have significant manufacturing presence. And then in 2019, we've seen that more than 3/4 of the chips sold were inputs in consumer electronics and motor vehicles, which are goods that are commonly consumed in Kenya and also the African market. And we've also seen a shift in government offering services towards digitized side, and which involves also ICs. So that's a short summary just to jog your minds on what has been said. I've seen a couple of questions on the inbox, and also there's some who've raised their hands. So I'll start with Dominic Mwirigi, who's raised his hand. Kindly unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you.
Yes. So Emmanuel, on his presentation, I think there's a part that he missed on the power needed for this for African countries to actually process these chips. As you said that East Asia dominates the trade, but as we have seen also when it comes also to something like solar panels, where Europe, or let's say America itself, find it too expensive to actually make these chips, and they do outsource, like you said when you mentioned outsourcing that production elsewhere. So that's why China, that's why you find that a country like China has really dominated this that part of the industry. And also when you talk about the processing, I would like you to talk about the policy change. As we see currently, our administration is talking about climate action, but if you're going to be realistic, when it comes to the policy on climate action, China had already projected that it will increase its carbon emissions to 2030 to peak levels. Then it will start declining. But you're finding when you already commit yourself to this climate action and let's say carbon credits, it makes it hard for mining to take place in a country like Kenya, processing to take place here, because obviously emissions will be created. So I'd like you to speak on that. And also, on lastly, when it comes to the capacity of labor, and not only just labor, we may have the brains, yes, but when you find that our labor laws, we don't have that labor freedom where, like in China, you have, yes, you have the skilled labor, yes, but they can do it cheaply. And like here, you find that labor unions actually make it more expensive for, if we did have the labor to process a chip factory, you find that the influence of labor unions actually make it's more difficult for us actually to manufacture it here. So they rather look for a cheaper place like in Eastern Asia, where they can actually do it cheaply and achieve their economies of scale. Thanks.
Thank you, Dominic, for that set of questions. Questions. So, Emmanuel and Maureen, I hope you've noted it, and then I'd like you to answer with also the questions that have been directed to you in the chat box. Kelvin asks, if you don't mind, kindly elaborate on how the governments are indirect consumers of integrated circuits. And then we have Ram, who asks, in developing countries, can producers be able to diversify into such a quaternary sector industry, that's high tech and research, without facing a large opportunity cost? So, Emmanuel, you can go first, answer Dominic's questions, and Kelvin and Ram, and then Maureen, you can add any additional comments, or you can tackle any question that you want to. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Melody, and thank you for your questions. So, Kevin, how are governments indirect consumers? Okay, because chips are everywhere. The cars that the government buys every year have chips within them. The devices, the computers that they buy have chips within them. And then the services that they have been digitizing, right, through the e-citizen, rely on chips indirectly because they rely on computers. More and more governments, and even Kenya government, is digitizing more of its services. So that means that indirectly, they are consumers of integrated circuits. You want to take the next one?
I'd actually like to add on how governments are indirect consumers of integrated circuits. If we go back to the role of the government, it's supposed to offer public goods, and in offering these public goods, and it also pays for some of the private goods that have positive externalities. And in doing so, the government might, in one way or another, require a digitization of services. Say, for instance, the government of Kenya will need to maybe produce passports, ID cards, among other things. And also maybe in terms of providing security, which is a public good. And with this, they might require use of advanced consumer electronic devices to provide these services. And this is how, in one way or another, the government is an indirect consumer of integrated circuits. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so is a question here about developing countries diversifying into this this sector, right, into semiconductors. Well, the short answer is, without facing a large opportunity cost, well, the short answer is probably very difficult. They can't. But now the long answer would be this. It costs, let's say, a typical just build a fab lab, right? A factory costs about $5 billion to build a factory, a typical semiconductor foundry. that after you've built it, you're probably waiting a few years, maybe 2 or 3 before it's profitable. And in order for it to be profitable, it has to run all the time, right? 24 hours a day. It can't, these factories can't stop, because if the margins are so thin that you want to be producing chips all the time. So in order to produce chips all the time, you need constant sources of power and very, very clean water. And this water in vast amounts, right? Consistently. Already that means a country like Kenya, a region like Nairobi would be unable to. And I could send you some of the numbers about, say, how much water it would take. Now, at the same time, though, there are the possibilities of entering the semiconductor supply chain at some point on the supply chain, right? Now, the details would remain unknown to me at this point, but I could point to the developments that I've seen in developments in the disruption of global supply chains that I've seen countries like India that has a per capita income that's just about the same as Kenya, but of course with a bit bigger manufacturing footprint. I mean, judging by the fact that we buy the Bajajs, the Tatas, the Hero motorcycles from India. I mean, they have more experience in manufacturing than Kenya does. Now that aside, it doesn't seem that fab labs, right, the semiconductor labs, the foundries are moving to India purely on by choice of the market. There seem to be government subsidies encouraging this, right? Because it's states like the United States that are looking for are actually being driven by political calculus to move these firms to a place like India. And you talk about friendshoring and reshoring of foundries. So friendshoring, India perhaps is looking more like a friend than, say, China is. They have their reasons for these conflicts. So that's one prospect that maybe some African countries, perhaps if they had, whatever is the criteria for favorable political posture, maybe they could have been home to some element, some participant on the semiconductor supply chain. Maybe South Africa could have that if it plays along, of course, again, according to whatever calculations they are making. But yes, the opportunity costs are very high. Now, in closing, even a PhD electrical engineer who's been training to work in semiconductors, they still require a lot of experience in the sector itself before they start really making and selling these chips, right? Before a firm is fully operational. So I think your question at the end there, the large opportunity cost, we can't get in without facing that large opportunity cost, and someone would have to hold the tab. Definitely, if it costs 5 billion to build a semiconductor foundry, a country like Kenya could never afford to do that. Now to Dominic. So Dominic, your first question was about maybe if you could reiterate, because you talked about climate change, how climate change policies are affecting, say, sectors like mining. But maybe you could,
I could come
yes,
again. Okay, so
yes,
the first part of that was hello, can you hear me?
yes, yes,
Okay, what I'm saying is those factories need a lot of electricity, and right now, if you look at how our industry is structured, people are driving themselves to areas that don't really require a lot of electricity, and of which, if you were to set up a factory here, we don't have, our grid wouldn't be able to feed those factories. On the second part is the commitments that we have already made on climate action, which actually wouldn't help us mine the rare earth materials that are needed and process them here. Like for China, they threw those commitments away and they focused on industrialization. Am I clear now?
Yes. So was it a question or a comment?
No, it was something that I noticed that you had missed in your
Ah.
presentation.
Okay.
Yes, and then on the other part of the question will be on the, you speak on the labor freedom that's limiting a factory actually to be set up here. Because if you consider East Asia, those are highly skilled people, but you find that the labor freedoms and how flexible they can actually, companies can actually pay those individuals to make those chips is slightly less compared to here. We have an issue with our labor unions when it comes to labor costs.
Right. So Dominic was making observations about how easy or difficult it is for a country like Kenya to set up these labs and or these firms in this sector, and not only that, how policies by the Kenyan government would actually prohibit that. Now, the scope of our presentation was actually to examine the trade of these chips itself and just highlight it as a development question. So we did not intend to actually ask what it would take to build a factory here and what obstacles there are. So that wasn't within the scope. But thank you for that comment, because it does add a bit more shape to the question of, okay, what can or should these African countries do? Which for us, we had just stopped short of asking that and just asked ourselves, okay, this is a development question, and let's show you how it is just as things stand before any questions about manufacturing or manufacturing policy. Yeah, thank you.
Excuse me, Emmanuel.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was just raising that because you're finding that the government has taken a turn when it comes to e-mobility. And you're finding we already have one factory that manufactures e-bikes. So that would also apply, considering that we already have a factory for e-bikes, but the government at the moment is flying blind when it comes to EVs. So I think that was my worry when it comes to that conversation. But I think that could be a meeting, a different meeting. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic and Kelvin and the rest who asked questions. Is there any additional comment or question someone could have? You can raise your hand or you can use the chat box to write it as we take the last round, and then I'll ask Emmanuel and Maureen to prepare their concluding remarks. So in case there's anyone else who has something to add, a question or a comment, the floor is open.
Need to have paired with conversations around climate change, because they sort of interlink. And thank you everyone for showing up, and yeah, thank you. Have a nice day.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. This conversation will continue, and we intend to continue tracking developments in the semiconductor market, but also presenting more and more of what we think uh, about Kenya's and the developing world's posturing around the issue and what could happen. So people like Dominic, please join us again as we continue, and perhaps we'll get closer and closer to those issues and those concerns that you also raised. And in addition, we also like to let you know that amongst the things that we've been doing, we've been running a program called the Adam Smith Scholars. And this program is actually geared towards young people with an interest in policy. So this is students both in high school and who are and also in university or who have just recently finished university. And we take them in and we put them through what it takes to be a policy scholar in the present day. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Emmanuel and Maureen, for the presentation. So you will find this presentation on our website once it's done with the editing, and then you can also follow our social media pages, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, for more information on upcoming events. And then IEA is also a membership organization. You are free to join, and you can send your inquiries at admin@iea-kenya.or.ke. Thank you so much for joining and for being part of this conversation. Have a lovely afternoon.